Okay, so good morning, everybody. Welcome again to the Scale-up Marketing Roundtables. We are really happy to have those of you back for a second session after the first really successful roundtable we had last week. Just to get straight into it, because obviously they're limited, they're really short, sharp looks at marketing, so I won't mess around too much at the start. We'll do a little bit of housekeeping, and then I'll hand you over to Ed, who's going to lead you through this session, which is all about the types of scale-up marketing that you might need for your business. So in terms of housekeeping, the session is slated for 30 to 45 minutes. So I think Ed's going to talk for about 15, 20 minutes, and there's plenty of opportunity for question and answer after that. So please, if you've got questions, make sure you shout them out. We are recording it, as you'll have heard, so we can share these sessions afterwards. And we'd love you to turn on your cameras if you're comfortable to do so. It does make the sessions much more engaging if we've got people's faces on camera. But also the last thing there is, whilst you are not talking, please can I ask you to put your microphones on mute, just so we limit the background noise whilst others are talking. Last but not least, the roundtables are brought to you by Agency Squared, Ed Davidson Marketing, Growth Division, and ISL Talent. So on that note, Ed, I will hand over to you to take it away. Oh, yeah, sorry, Ed, I missed out the other roundtables. What a faux pas that is. So just to quickly run through then, the next session after this one is on the 12th of May, which is what does marketing cost and how do you measure ROI, which Tristan will be leading from Growth Division. Session number 4 is you've got a marketing problem, should you hire? So Alan's going to be leading that from ISL Talent. That's on the 18th of May. And then last but not least, with my juggling act at the start, on the 27th of May is finding and hiring the best fit agency. That's the one that I'll be leading. So there we go. Finally, I got through the introductions and the housekeeping, and I'll pass you over to Ed.
And yeah, I'm looking forward to your session with juggling. It's how many balls you can juggle at the same time.
I'll do my best.
Yeah. So everyone, and I hope you're having a great weekend, long weekend. So I am an independent marketing growth consultant. That is me on the left. That's my little son, Charlie, on the right. Always put a baby picture in the summer in the presentation. He's a lot cuter than me. But yeah, I am looking forward to taking you through this session. Chuck any questions to me as we're going through, if you think kind of relevant and worthwhile. It's good to have an interactive session, or we've got a kind of round table at the end where we'll hopefully bring some kind of thoughts together and get some conversations going, which I think would be useful as well. I am sometimes called a fractional CMO, and we'll go over that, what is that in a moment. But yeah, in terms of kind of my background, I worked client side for about 15 years. Some of the brands that you may kind of know, have heard of, Experian and kind of REC, so larger scale companies. And then I also worked for some VC-backed startups. I worked for 4 partners for a year, and also some private equity-backed telecoms companies as well. And in terms of what I do now, so I am kind of independently working with a number of different scale-ups and startups, often kind of VC-backed, private equity-backed. A few kind of examples. So Content Cal, worked with those guys last year, and a great success story for them in terms of being bought by Adobe. Working with a healthcare client called Practice Plus Group, and we're doing good things in terms of increasing their number of elective surgeries for hips, knees, and cataracts, all to do with the restrictions on the NHS. So that's a good story as well. And then on the B2B side, working with likes of 26, so larger B2B agencies, and also the great guys at Growth Division. So done some work with these guys that are on the call. Great model to work with in terms of early stage startups, working with a number of different specialists. So that's me. And in terms of, super briefly, that's a nice zoomed in view of me with some great crow's feet going on there. But in terms of a fractional CMO and what the blazes that is, I think, Alan's going to go into a lot more detail about the type of people and the team that you need at a later date in one of the sessions. But in terms of a fractional CMO, I am divided. And I'm working across a number of different companies. And I think the advantage of that is I bring some level of independent guidance to companies looking to scale up. You can do it based on kind of a day rate basis. So it takes the risk out of hiring somebody full time. and also allows companies that are moving from startup to scale up to be able to test and see which expertise they need in-house. So that's a little bit more, I suppose, in terms of an individual work in the company. And I'm sure Alan will do a massive deep dive in terms of the people you need overall. That's enough about me. Over to you and where you guys are in terms of that movement to a startup to scale up. I love this film. Watched it a number of times recently in terms of a Mad Max view of where you are. So you're in the position, in the desert. You validated some customers. You've got this far. You've got some traction. You most likely you've got some level of funding or are very efficiently bootstrapped. But you need to get to where you want to be. You need to get to a repeatable and scalable model and drive that level of predictable kind of growth that you're looking for. And you're ready to take that next step to scale and ready to change. So how are we going to go about doing this? So as I was researching for this and going kind of through the detail, I was reaching out to founders that I've worked with that have managed to go through kind of scale up start up to scale up and move to those kind of steps. So I had some good, honest feedback from guys that were kind of in the trenches and pushing forward. I quite like this view from Matt Fox, great guy, one of the co-founders of Snaptrip. And he says it gets harder. And I thought that was interesting because I think often with every kind of startup, it's like, well, the validation bit's hard. The scale up bit, you just get, you start driving things forward. His opinion was that validation, getting those easy wins, that level of organic growth earlier on the level of the advancement of the company is quite easy. When you start feeling the pressure from all different sides, you've got to start scaling across all different parts, and you're having pressure from your finance, from the investors, from the board. It gets harder in that way. So how are you going to create this platform to scale? And I kind of see this as a little bit of a mixed view of Brian Balfour's fits and a bit of Pete Blair, because I'm a big fan of his as well, in terms of these 4 fits for growth. Now, last week, Tom went through a lot of detail on product market fit, so we won't touch on that too much, but I think that's table stakes at this stage. The next bit is obviously the product channel fit, which the growth division guys kind of specialize in. I think the one thing to mention there is sometimes channels fit very well to particular products based on an ARPU versus kind of CAC position. So it helps refine the channels that you're going to go after and make sure you're not stuck in that middle ground where things don't work out. The bits that I'm going to explore a little bit more detail later on is these other 2 areas. So market message fit, we talk about that in terms of a brand, but also about how you get a message that resonates with your target market and really deeply resonates so that you can then drive it forward. And I think the other part of how that's distilled down is how you take that message and apply it to the channels that you're going to then acquire customers from. And not every message or view of message works particularly well with each channel. So that needs to be refined to be able to find that right balance and the sweet spot within each of these channels. Knowing these 4 areas, first and foremost, gives you that platform to start scaling things up, and then we can move forward from there. But, as mentioned, and it should always be mentioned, your view of the customer. And this is a bit of an oldie but a goodie, and I've seen it a couple of times recently, so I'd call it out again. The 2 princes, the Prince of Wales and the Prince of Darkness, both look like the your ideal customers in terms of that demographic breakdown. And if you were to view them and say, oh, they're the same customer, obviously they have extreme different tastes in guitars and maybe cars. So it's worthwhile knowing who those customers are. But also in the context of moving from a startup to a scale up, it's viewing yourself and saying, am I going after the same customers? Is there enough TAM to be able to scale that out? Or am I have to thinking about different customer sets in order to be able to grow as well? So the second one, Daniel at Lexu, he was really hot on the view of this classic Pareto 80-20 and moving from being 80% around experimentation and being general to 80% time being specialized. And that is the distinct view when you move from that startup experimentation to having things in place and you're doubling down and you're growing. So what I've taken there and this is a bit wordy, this slide, but I think it's useful in terms of the subdivisions, in terms of that movement from generalizing to specializing, how you think in terms of your marketing mix, but also your marketing processes. So channels, we've talked about, often you're experimenting with different channels. Often there has to be an element of direct response to it because you're trying to make sure things work. You need to see those results. Next, you're focusing and doubling down on those core growth channels, the ones that work. I think as Peter Thiel was talking about, a company can have one channel, one or two channels that can provide 80% of their revenue. So you need to make make sure that those channels sing. Potentially, you're acquiring other companies as well to help you grow. You're not just thinking about organic level of growth as well. So that's a consideration. And then content. So my cousin, actually, James Griffith of Mouse, he was talking about how much content is so important as you start to scale. A methodical process of creating content and dividing the content and using it across your marketing channels. That was a really important part for him. Second part, as well as territories, I'm not going to go through all in too much detail, but you often have one territory. You will move into multiple territories as you scale. You've got to think about what's repeatable in that territory, what channels, but also the type of customers that are there, and if that works. People, I'm sure Alan will go into a lot more detail. You're going from that broad skill set to that super focused specialist, channel ownership, understanding that in detail. I think the other part of it, as well as you scale the team, that onboarding of new people and how they're brought into the ethos and the values of the company is super important as well. But leadership, you need to have clear leadership and a leadership team that you might not have had in terms of your marketing org structure that you would as a startup. Tech and data, it's all about having a MarTech stack that will scale and be in place, but also the data be able to support it as well. And then I'm going to funnel optimization in a moment, but system and processes, at the moment, they're often kind of limited or kind of manual, and you're lacking time in that way. The CMO, I know, the company called Zappa was talking about Cadence. So Cadence and that rhythm of meetings and reporting helps you to then be able to compound that level of growth and scale as well. How am I doing for time, Andy? A few more.
You're fine, Ed, keep going.
Cool. Okay, so Alex, I had a chat with him and he talked about a mini brand. So I like to call it like digging the moat, right? Digging the brown moat. When you have a level of competition, everyone is obviously trying to build more features, build more things that differentiate. A brand and helping you to kind of have that position that stands you against everyone else gets you in a far better position than when you're spending or you're taking different actions. This is compounded against the brand. I think key points to call out here is a few guys mentioned the importance of the vision and the mission that ties into the brand, and that drives the rest of the business and being involved in it, and a clear point of view and a clear purpose which has legitimacy, and through telling the story of how you came about and what you stand for. All these things that the message you push out and the people that you bring in the team as they scale up is going to help have a clear differentiator for you in the market compared to the competition. And look, last one. I think when you're at a kind of startup mode, you're not necessarily focused on key parts from the data. It may be that you're trying to do a lot of different things. Andrew Hunter, a friend of mine, Azuna, is talking about like this full funnel as well, thinking about the full funnel. And I'm a massive fan of the bow tie funnel. I think everyone does naturally think about driving, from acquiring a customer down to converting to a customer. But that level of advocacy and a brand ambassador is a huge part that drives leads back in. So it's kind of this leaky funnel that people talk about. I think you can leak in different areas, and it's up to you to understand which parts are leaking the most and which parts you can make the most amount of difference. In terms of the levers in which you pull in that way, I've always been interested to see that you can pull one lever and you can think it and have a massive difference to certain metrics, but there's an output that something else happens in the funnel through that lever being pulled. So thinking about the impact to one area and how that affects the other area of the funnel in terms of this bow tie is something which I think is super important as well. So I've been going through a lot of detail there, so it'd be great, Andy, to open it up to questions, but I hope that's been kind of useful, and it'd be good to hear everyone else's kind of view at this stage as well.
Yeah, Ed, thanks very much. That was really useful. I really like the bow tie funnel. And I've got a couple of questions, but rather than me jump in, I'd love to open it out to any of our attendees first to see if there are any other questions. Ed, I don't know if you want to stop sharing your screen so we can just have our faces up, that'd be great. There we go. So any questions from around the room or the table? No, a little bit of silence. Okay, I don't mind getting this kicked off. I really like that emphasis on the bow tie funnel between acquisition and retention. It felt to me like at that early stage startup that acquisition is more of the focus. And then when we move into scale up, that's where we want to focus more on post-purchase or retention. Do you got any sense as to whether I'm on the right track there, or also what the kind of emphasis should be? Is that 80-20, do you think, at the start, 80% acquisition, 20% post-purchase? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think at the at startup stage that you need to have a kind of deep understanding of your customers, and obviously that's very clear in terms of you having ultimate kind of feedback because you've got a smaller group of customers, right? So keeping those customers and keeping them happy is kind of hugely important because they naturally will become advocates. I think as you start to scale, and it's difficult to juggle those customers over time, having processes in place and keeping them happy, but understanding kind of who are the most valuable customers, I think becomes a lot more important. And then you can kind of double down. I mean, often the term is a whale. If you can identify more of those whales to go after, I think that's important as well, and how you look after them. The kind of the lifetime value, you don't necessarily understand that as much as an early stage. Obviously, the longer you have those kind of relationships with those customers, the longer you can understand what ongoing lifetime value they have, what else they can scale out into, and that will help you understand, well, what is your kind of breaking point in terms of your fixed cost or your CAC, your kind of cost per acquisition as well. So as you start scaling stuff up as well. And the other part is around kind of cohorts of customers as well, and seeing how they perform. If they're brought in at different times through different channels, how sticky they are, how long do they stay around for, and if it's a subscription model, what else are they buying as well. So I think you have more understanding as you scale up. Tom, have you got views on that as well?
Yeah, I was just going to add a little bit to that, because I think when we're working with startups and scale-ups, we like to kind of see the early customer base almost being advocates and brand ambassadors, and I think if they are kind of bought into the product and the mission of the company, the early stages, and they've got like a kind of really loyal early customer base, it's always a really good sign, because then you can focus more on acquisition of getting more of those customers. I think where we see kind of like shaky foundations of customers, a bit of disengaged with the company, or like churning a lot, then just pouring more on top of the funnel, as you know, like the leaky bucket, they're just going to churn out, and actually the business doesn't stack up. So it's always a tricky one, sometimes pushing back on founders and saying, like, look, actually this isn't the time to layer on loads of paid growth channels, for example, when you've got a leaky bucket, and you're better spent on that side of the bow tie trying to make your customers more like advocates.
You could almost say that we're used to look at the bow tie more of a balancing act, a pair of scales. Getting it right on both sides could balance it out and give you the result you're looking for, rather than overemphasizing on acquisition on one side or retention on the other. Okay.
I think the interesting thing about sorry, go on. Sorry, Brad.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question. Oh, sorry, was someone else?
Go on, Brad. Go on, Brad.
So I really do like that bow tie graphic. I actually screen grabbed it, so thank you for that. But I think, and you're all probably far better marketers than I am, I think that visual for me is customer acquisition and customer retention, which are disciplines that come after marketing and scale-up marketing. So in my mind, that is what you do with the inbound result of the marketing that you've either effectively or ineffectively deployed. So my question is, if I just think about the bow tie context, what best practices do you have around customer retention and using that as a marketing tool. So the things that come to my mind is a customer referral program where you can use delighted customers to get new customers. The other thing that we've been talking about is a customer forum. You talk about having brand ambassadors. If you kind of get these really vehement brand ambassadors into a small circle and do some sort of promotional work around that, making it sort of like a club that, hey, we get this solution, we love this solution, we are doing smarter and better things than others are, come join us. That's a marketing tactic in my mind. But so I guess that would be question number one, is other thoughts around the right side of the bow tie and how you do marketing with that. But then what I haven't heard so far is how do you get people into becoming customers, and what are the marketing motions that I didn't hear talked about?
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, in terms of the right-hand side of the bow tie and retention, also that kind of natural view that it'll help feed in the left-hand side as well, as you say. Yeah, referral schemes, I think, are super powerful. I think that sometimes it depends if, I don't know if you're kind of B2B or B2C, you can have motions or activity that help you in terms of technology to be able to deliver on that. Or it very much comes, you are engaging with your customers through kind of regular meetings and engagements. I think the other major part for me is around case studies and reviews in terms of solidifying social proof that the company stands up to where they are. And increasingly, rightly or wrongly, people don't necessarily think in terms of context other than how other people review. I think I mentioned it maybe on the last call, I'm a massive fan of Chris Walker as well, and he talks about the dark social and the dark funnel in terms of where these conversations are going on with existing customers that you don't necessarily see in terms of attribution, and having those kind of fed back. So I think I'll call out those two areas as well. I mean, it naturally falls in terms of customer marketing, how you're engaging with those different audiences. If you can build a community, that's super powerful. I think sometimes it's hard to say I will do that because it's a lot of time engagement and there's something that really needs to stand out there. But if you can have independent Slack channels where you're having people help out and support.
Can I chip in there as well, Ed? Just to,
Go for it.
I think that you're absolutely right. The social proof there, the case studies and the reviews are really good. How about something really simple like a net promoter score that just showing how your customers are reviewing you on a really comparable basis, benchmarking basis is really strong as well. On the community point there, I think that's a massive subject. How do you build and manage community around a brand? And I think trying to tackle that lightly is likely to fall in limited success. So tackling community, I think, is a big project and probably needs some serious thought. But sorry, Ed, over to you. I think you're about to move on to answer Brad's second question.
Yeah, just on the on obviously how you're acquiring customers and how you're scaling up. I think the one thing that I'd say is your blended CPA is super important. So in the kind of first session, Brad, we were talking about that kind of mixture in terms of direct response and brand. But also what I call inbound and outbound. So how you're then kind of building up and scaling the channels that is a clear CPA against them in terms of cost for delivering, but also you're building either evergreen channels like content or SEO, or you're building channels that have some level of reflected brand engagement, because those channels help reduce your direct response channels over time. And then I'm cutting my slides down here, but I would separate them out into paid, owned, and earned in terms of that view of paid are your direct kind of channels that you're pushing out there. Owned are things like your website or your social channels, and I'd really emphasize social channels based on either your employees or yourself rather than the company, because it's a lot harder to do from a company perspective. And then earned is your reflective things, I suppose, like social proof, or about who else is then talking about you in those wider channels, and get those three areas singing. That is a whistle-stop tour of paid, owned, and earned, but there you go.
I was going to say we did cover some more of that, Brad, in the first session. So if you do get the chance, do check that out. I suppose just chip in a further thought on the first point around the kind of leveraging your existing customers for marketing. Something that we like to stress is it seems simple, but just understanding your customer base with data a little bit more, like, kind of making sure you've captured, data points in your CRM. You're seeing like, what kind of things that they're, viewing and interested in. And if in your case, I think it's more B2B, but even in B2C sense, you could like, have better kind of like analytics tools like Mixpanel or Amplify that, just enable you to really understand your customer base, because then it helps you get more of those customers that are the good customers, and then it helps with all your kind of up the funnel marketing activities and you can even like, for example, you could do like a Facebook audience based on your current customers, and that will help you get more of them, for example. So just really knowing your customers and that side of the funnel is, I think, super important, which maybe sort of more old school marketing just sort of like chucks them over to sales and then doesn't really like evaluate what kind of customers you actually close at the end of the day. That's that kind of loop that you need to kind of plug, really, is kind of getting that data back into the marketing activities.
Thanks, Tom. Any further questions from around the roundtable?
I had a quick one just on you mentioned the brand moat there, Ed. I know we touched on the kind of like how to quantify a brand last time, which was a bit of a difficult one. I don't know whether you've got any thoughts specifically around like how to kind of, I suppose, quantify or get a feel that you are building up a moat, and just kind of, everyone, like, that's something we try and achieve, but like, how do we actually kind of recognize progress in that sort of area?
Yeah, I think we talked about kind of last week around how we can see customer feedback through something like Net Promoter Score. I know it's been kind of mentioned here before. I suppose ideally you want to have KPIs associated with it, which kind of shows that level of engagement. I think we kind of mentioned as well the level of if you're seeing classic analytics in terms of brand search or direct traffic, in terms of people that are hearing from you and they're not coming directly from those channels as well. I think if you really are starting to see some proper engagement and some scale, just things like Google Trends, to be able to see what where are you being searched for, where are you being kind of where is the brand having that kind of resonance, or if it's wider like values and propositions that you're selling on the market, and if that's kind of resonating as well within the market, and then you can pull that off. I think that that is what we can do in terms of a quant thing, but I suppose the brand is such an emotional connection as well. It's trying to have those qual conversations with customers. As you say, is the position kind of resonating with them, and are they kind of really shouting about you and kind of advocating for you as well? And even I'd say if you have a super positive tweet or comment or a mention from the customer, those are the kind of things that it's hard to put a metric on, but are kind of so powerful, because that's where you can kind of see that people are going to be mentioning you, either in terms of water cooler moments online, obviously, because most of us are kind of home now or in the office, but where they're mentioning and talking about you, especially where I suppose from a longer consideration set from a consumer perspective in terms of higher cost of product, or from a consideration set from a B2B perspective, that people are talking about you, and you're in that consideration set there, and therefore you have some recognition. The more you can get that, and I would also say push that out to your team that you're scaling as well, because they get such a buzz off seeing that level of customer feedback and positive brand recognition, will start driving things forward as well. But it's a tough one. It's a tough one.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Actually, it got me thinking that actually something we've anecdotally done in the past is almost ask your customers what they think the value proposition, your value proposition is. So how do they phrase back to you what they think your value is, and actually are they like saying the sort of right things that you have as a brand in your head with like how you're trying to position yourself. And I suppose if they're saying the right things and identifying the kind of positioning statements that you're trying to put out there, it's obviously a good sign that they're picking up on those.
And if you can reverse engineer that to help validate it, I think that's really interesting to see if everything's got that common line. I think the other thing which is really interesting, and it's very brave for an organization to do this, but it's great if you stand for something, is you're forming your anti-ICP, which I quite like. It's like, this is the people I don't want to buy my product or my service, and these are the reasons why. Because you're either standing for something, or it's like, no, these people aren't what I'm looking for, and these people are what I'm thinking about. And as you say, if you can get that resonation back from the brand and get it to sing, then I think that would be great as well.
I love that idea, the anti-ICP. As you say, that's quite a brave stance to take, isn't it? Because you're qualifying people out at the very early stage of your funnel. But I had a question for you, and I think you kind of answered it in that last conversation there, which was you talked about market message fit. And I guess part of that would be, if you ask your customers to come back to you, what do you think we do for our customers? And they can clearly, respond in a fashion you'd expect. And I guess that really is a symbol that you've got your market message fit right, along with, of course, the other metrics you might put around, brand, mention, share of search, some of the other things you mentioned earlier on. So actually less of a question, more of an observation and a statement, I suppose. I
often work with clients, and I always see, especially if they've gone through a level of change, it's what is the value prop in relation to the competition? And there's an argument to say, just ignore the competition, you build what you want, but customers do think either outside of their emotions in relation to the competition, right? So being able to be very clearly articulating that value proposition to a message, people talk about an elevator pitch or a 1 second, line, but it has something that resonates with them, that they can get it, together with the kind of values that helps them then stand out, have that emotional connection. The companies that stand out in that way with a clear offer and kind of proposition tied to it are the ones that I see that really succeed. So knowing that down is super important, which is message market fit. And then obviously the channel message fit is how you distill that down to the channels that you want to do, which is harder from a tweet than it is from kind of content, long form content you're producing.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay.
And on that note, I think you can chip in on like the click-through rates and activation rates of like those specific channels. Like that's how we kind of measure like differences in messaging. So if, for example, like a certain Google ad message, you're trying to test this one phrase versus another phrase, and the click-through rate is higher on one of them, you can kind of get a feel for like that's the kind of message that's resonating in that specific channel. Again, with like things like email click rates and that sort of thing, like if you're kind of saying the right things, you should see better engagement.
Yeah, I completely agree, and that's a good way of being able to test those messages into the overall message, how it applies to the channels. And the one thing I didn't in my notes I didn't mention as well is that it's a certain things that still should remain from when you go to a startup to a scale up, is that test and learn philosophy, right? And you're doing that at scale, but you still need to make sure that you have it, and you're pushing things forward and continuously, normally running like, Tom and Tristan advocate in terms of kind of ICE models about how you're then prioritizing what should be tested, but that ethos still needs to be maintained as well, and just execution at speed.
Yeah, I think that agility comes through from that test and learn. We talked about the bullseye framework in the last session, and using that as a way to manage and monitor iterations and tests, etc. I think is a clear theme coming across from both of these two sessions, is the need to test and iterate, or test, learn and iterate, I think.
Ed, I was surprised that we hadn't mentioned the crossing the chasm early adopter, innovator early adopter model in this, because I think it's quite an important one when you're thinking about actually moving from that startup to that scale up phase. I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on like how potentially the kind of customer personas that you're targeting change from like innovators through to early adopters, and then even when you're moving into the early majority. I think you did touch on, testing and thinking about new ICPs or ideal customer profiles as you move through the phases. But what's kind of the process of that? And I don't know, like maybe when you're working with Content Cal or any of your previous companies, if you have like specific examples of that, I'd be quite interested to hear.
Yeah, a good chat. Just I tried to touch on it briefly, I suppose, on the two princes, Prince of Darkness. But yeah, no, you're right, and there is often that move. Often also I see with kind of companies that are moving up the food chain potentially as well. So starting off with kind of smaller organizations and then kind of moving up to kind of enterprise or larger companies. I think sometimes there needs to be a consideration of channels and how those channels are appropriate for those types of companies. So it might be you can't get a hold of this decision set with the channels that you did initially as you're moving up the food chain to senior people in senior organizations, for example, and you need to tailor your marketing mix for those channels. I think as well, how leads are generated in terms of, you know, a classic, say, kind of MQL, SQL with smaller or even kind of first early engagements you have with customers. You need to move, you know, naturally, like we talked about brand awareness, to a kind of maybe an ABM strategy that I'm working with other clients from a B2B perspective, because you're trying to influence people at a different level for a far larger average order value. And that needs to be considered, and you need to tailor and adapt in that way as well. I suppose that, you know, like we talked about messaging and positioning, I suppose it also needs to be considered across different areas. Sometimes where you're you know, approaching different sectors. Before, it might have been that you just focused on one sector, and then you're thinking about different people within each sector. Self-identifying either through the you know, your website or the content you produce and having it appropriate to those sectors, I've seen works quite well. And then sometimes if you do have SDRs that back up each of those progressions into different sectors and you're scaling up into that, that helps you to grow in those areas as well.
Yeah, nice. Because yeah, it does. It makes a lot of sense. And because I've spoken to some like startup founders who are like very early stage, and you know, already on their website they have like, you know, 6 different sectors that they work within, and you know, a very undefined ideal customer profile. And that can be fine when you're kind of at the latter stages of kind of, you know, scaling into the market. But at early stages where you have limited resources, you know, surely it really makes sense to really focus your messaging and everything around a single ICP and a single problem for that ICP. And that's kind of where I do often see it quite a lot talking to early stage founders, where there's a lack of focus a lot of the time. And actually that's where I really like that kind of crossing the chasm model, is that it's very focused on kind of solving a specific problem for innovators in the early stages. But then as you kind of scale and you build your resources and you kind of beachhead into one specific customer profile, that's when you can kind of move on to other ones. And that's where it starts to make sense to kind of build out your messaging for different sectors or different size customers, even, as you say.
Yeah, and you, yeah, definitely niching down and having that resonance with that particular tighter ICP, even though it's essentially a smaller TAM, enables you to establish there, and then you can scale up. I mean, the argument is the same as sometimes when you move into companies in terms of that a beachhead in the sector, or even a customer in terms of what I call it land and expand, but also land and expand and refer. Once you're in, you can engage with people and you scale out the relationship, and then there's obviously referral elements off the back of it as well. Andy, you're right for time. I don't know if we've gone over.
Yeah, no, we have a few minutes left. So if there are any further questions from around the round table, then please feel free to shout them out now. Otherwise, we'll probably we'll call it a day. So one last trip around the table. Any further thoughts, questions, or observations?
And feel free, any questions anyone's got, feel free to shoot them over. And yeah, thanks a lot, and look forward to the other sessions.
Yeah, okay. Ed, thanks very much. Sounds like we're all out of questions here. So as Ed said, if you think of a burning question, perhaps afterwards, ping it over on an email and we'll do our best perhaps to answer it in a future session. On that note, the next roundtable will be on the 12th, Thursday, the 12th of May, and that's going to be led by Tristan from Growth Division. Tristan, here's your chance for a bit of a sales pitch. What are you going to be talking about in your session?
Yeah, so I mean, if any of you guys on the call today are in the process, or you know, it's kind of a constant process, but thinking about, you know, how to resource your growth budgets, and how to even come up with a marketing budget in the first place, like how much should you be putting forwards to growth compared to, you know, other areas where you need to resource, such as technology, products, people, etc. So in the next session, I'm going to be diving into how to build this initial marketing budget, you know, how much you should be putting forwards. And that question is fundamental in terms of how much you should go and raise as well. So, you know, how to build your initial growth budgets to hit some initial targets that you're trying to think about. But then also going into some further questions around like then how to measure the success of that when you're actually running the marketing campaigns. So yeah, it should be a useful one, especially if anyone's kind of going out and raising money, but you know, also very useful if you're looking just to build out your growth budgets for the coming few months. It should be a useful session.
Excellent. Thanks, Tristan. So on that note, if you're on the call, you have already registered for Tristan's session. So just look out for an email from me, probably the day before, just with a reminder and the Zoom link. Just for everyone, we are on in the UK, so we're operating on GMT +1 British summertime right now. So if you're overseas, just make a note in your calendar. I'll make the recordings of this one and the first session hopefully available for session number 3. So if you have missed the first one, you can catch up in advance of that next one. And on that note, I think we are done. So thank you everybody for joining us for the Scale-up Marketing Roundtables. And we look forward to seeing you at the next session, which again, Thursday, 12th of May.